You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, coming to you from Chicago.
Katie, you sure are moving around a lot these days.
I've decided that 2022 is going to be my nomadic year, so we'll see where I go next.
Well, speaking of moving around, and I hope listeners will pardon that awful segue, a lot of world leaders are currently arriving in Madrid, Spain, as we record this, for a very highly anticipated NATO summit. We don't usually talk about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on this podcast, but this time, as NATO meets, there is a particularly stark focus on the Indo-Pacific. And of course, it's not just the Indo-Pacific. The alliance is meeting, of course, against the backdrop of Russia's war against Ukraine, which poses in many ways one of the most significant challenges for NATO in decades. There's also a lot more happening with Finland and Sweden acceding to NATO. Just hours before recording this podcast, we got news that Turkey has dropped its opposition, so the alliance will be expanding from 30 to 32 countries soon. But the big news for those of us who focus on Asia is the historic attendance at the leader level at this NATO summit by Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. Four democracies in the Indo-Pacific that collaborate in various ways among themselves and with the United States and other countries in the region that are now at the NATO summit. So that's really what we're looking at. So, Katie, I mean, what's your impression here of the extent to which the summit is going to focus on Asia and, of course, China, which NATO is expected to describe as a systemic challenge alongside Russia and its upcoming strategic concept? What's your take on this whole summitry that's happening in Madrid?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important and worth highlighting the Asian leaders that are coming to NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I almost said that wrong. And it has a European focus. It's a European body for all intents and purposes with the United States. So the fact that these Asian leaders are coming and having their own meetings with NATO and this sort of NATO Pacific focus really highlights the China challenge that all of these countries see. And so there's certainly synergies between the leaders that are coming from Asia. You mentioned the Australian Prime Minister. We have the Japanese Prime Minister, the South Korean President, and the Prime Minister of New Zealand, correct? And so, the fact that they're coming all the way to Spain for this NATO summit really, I think, highlights the shared concerns that they have about Asia. They also, I think, have shared concerns about Russia, and those concerns are related. I'm interested to hear what you have to think about, this sort of coming of Asia to Europe. Is this important?
I think it is. I mean, there's a lot happening here. First of all, I mean, I think you have the security concerns that all of the states, the 30 member states of NATO, and the four Asian leaders attending, have about the perception of a China-Russia axis or entente. I wouldn't call it an alliance for various reasons, of course, but the alignment between China and Russia, I think, is a much greater concern for everybody as they meet in Madrid. Like I said, NATO will describe Russia alongside China as a systemic challenge and frame the strategic concept accordingly. NATO has also, for a few years now, taken an interest in China. I believe the first that transition really happened in 2018 and 2019 as NATO began to look eastward in general as sort of the geopolitical gravity of the world started to really, I think, shift, and U.S.-China relations in particular took a nosedive under the Trump administration. But the other thing that I think is going on here is, alliances are built on shared values, and I think there is a strong component here that at least the Biden administration, I think, would emphasize that these are like-minded democracies that support a rules-based order, not only in Europe but also in Asia. And so using the NATO summit as an opportunity to show that unity is, I think, another thing that many of these countries value in the current context. The other thing I wanted to sort of get a sense of, is, or at least that I'm going to be looking for, is how the two newer leaders, which is Prime Minister Albanese and President Yoon Suk Yeol of South Korea, use the NATO summit to sort of drop some markers for their thinking about approaching Europe. I think for South Korea, this is going to be a big moment. Yoon, there's expected to be an announcement that South Korea will set up a mission in Brussels at NATO headquarters full time, and the Yoon administration is also working on its own Indo-Pacific strategy, and I think we'll get some markers for where this is going. What are some of the things you might be looking for here, Katie, on the sort of deliverable side or the outcome side as the
So
leaders meet?
I mean, certainly from looking at this just from the Asian perspective, because I think we could certainly talk about Ukraine and get sort of distracted by that a little bit. But, when it comes to the Asian leaders that are there, I am most interested in sort of the outcomes of the planned meeting between Biden, Yoon, and Kishida. If my research is correct, it'll be the first trilateral summit between the three leaders of those countries since 2017, I believe. And so, a lot has changed since 2017. Those are, I mean, last time these countries would have met in that format, you would have had President Donald Trump, you would have had Shinzo Abe, and you would have had, is Park still president?
Moon Jae-in.
Was Moon president? Okay, Moon was then. Got to get my dates right. But you have considerable change in sort of the political leadership of these countries since 2017, and so I think it will be interesting to kind of set a baseline. South Korean and Japanese relations are not always the strongest, and so I think in that format will be interesting to see how the two newer leaders interact. I know you're watching that particular one. I don't want to steal your thunder. What are you looking for in that trilateral meeting?
Well, I think, like you said, the fact that it's going to happen is going to be a big deal. The Biden administration, I think, has a particular interest in trilateralism in Northeast Asia. They sort of see the departure of both President Moon and Prime Minister Abe as, and Prime Minister Suga to some extent, who's very close to Abe, as opening up new opportunities for a reset of sorts. I think things still have a way to go. I think Japan in particular is still waiting to see just how quickly it can start approaching the Yoon administration. But the fact that this summit is taking place in Madrid, I think, is again a good sign. It sort of reminds me of, I believe it was in 2014 when President Obama brought together then Park Geun-hye and Shinzo Abe for their first meeting as leaders in a trilateral summit on the sidelines of the Nuclear Security Summit in The Hague. And so maybe there's something about bringing Northeast Asian leaders to Europe that makes these kinds of trilateral interactions a little bit easier. But I think, there'll be a big focus on Northeast Asia. There's a lot, on North Korea, which has certainly been testing its fair share of missiles this year, raising concerns in both Korea and Japan. And I think, the statement overall that I'm expecting to see out of that will hopefully be forward-looking with some specifics on where the three countries might cooperate. Taking a step back, the NATO summit, I think, is important, and I think we'll come back to it because we're recording this right as it's about to kick off. But the thing I wanted to also sort of bring up briefly was the meeting of the G7 in Germany. We just had a G7 summit. The G7 released a leader statement that, I might be wrong about this, a listener should let me know, but I believe this leader's communique that was released at the end of the G7 meeting in Germany mentioned China more than any previous G7 communique after a leader summit, which again, I think emphasizes the extent to which these seven countries are particularly interested in the China issue, a lot on human rights, on Hong Kong, East and South China Seas, rules-based order issues in general. The big deliverable that I think we should talk about, Katie, is the G7 announced a new partnership for global infrastructure and investment, which is going to be a $600 billion fund by 2027. That's the date by which the G7 plans to actually put this amount of money together to support global infrastructure investments. And, if this sounds familiar to listeners, it's because it's not the first initiative of this kind coming from the West. The EU announced its Global Gateway Initiative, which was quite similar. And this is yet another attempt to sort of symmetrically compete with China and China's Belt and Road Initiative and massive amounts of infrastructure funding at a time when I think a lot of lower income countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America are starting to get much more skeptical about Chinese infrastructure investment funding. But any thoughts from you, Katie, on sort of the G7 and this infrastructure thing? I mean, is this going to be more of the same, or is there a chance that the G7 might be able to pull this together in a way that might actually give China a run for its money when it comes to competing for financing in various countries around the world that certainly I think will have demand for infrastructure funds?
There's certainly a lot of demand for infrastructure funding from developing countries around the world, and as you said, increasing skepticism about Chinese funding. But the Chinese funding exists, and we'll have to see if this initiative can pony up the money. Because, as you pointed out, there have been various efforts to sort of generate an initiative like this and say, we're going to fund this number of things, this a large amount, but it has not come to fruition in the way that Chinese BRI funding has. And so until the West can deliver the dollars, it remains on paper. And so I think, hope springs eternal. So maybe this time this one will work out, but we'll have to see. Is the unfortunate answer. Is there is definitely demand, and certainly the West has a lot of expertise to share and funding to pony up, but the money actually has to come together and get to countries. And development projects are not simple. These are not short endeavors. And once you start factoring in, regulations and all of the environmental concerns for a given dam project or something, it gets complicated. And so the initiative is a good idea. We'll have to see how it pans out in reality.
Yeah, and I think on that note, the White House statement on the PGII, as it's called, says that the United States will be announcing certain flagship projects, and some of these are sort of described in a series of bullets. So there's projects that are happening in various parts of Africa, including a solar project in Angola that's described. Other cooperation on sort of public health issues, vaccine development related to COVID-19 and other issues as well. So it seems that there's some meat on the bones here. But I think I generally agree that we'll have to see where cooperation can actually manifest here. Before we move on, just wanted to quickly note that this episode is brought to you by Quarterly Essay. Quarterly Essay is Australia's leading journal of politics, culture, and debate. Their latest issue, Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America by Hugh White, explores Australia's fateful choice to back America to the hilt and oppose China. White assesses America's credibility and commitment by examining AUKUS, the Quad, Trump, and Biden. He discusses what the Ukraine conflict tells us about the future and argues that the U.S. can neither contain China nor win a war over Taiwan. For over 20 years, Quarterly Essay has been at the forefront of political discussion, publishing award-winning essays from outstanding writers, journalists, and commentators. Use promo code DIPLOMAT, all caps, to take 20% off an ebook or print copy of this original essay by Australia's leading strategic thinker. Read more at quarterlyessay.com.au. Okay, back to our discussion. It's interesting to see the G7 and the NATO summits take place back to back. I think, again, it's this moment that really shows the unity of the West in many ways. The G7, of course, being a much smaller group than NATO. 6 out of the G7 countries are NATO members, plus you have Japan, which is also present at the summit, as we just discussed. But I thought, the optics of that, I think, are very interesting to sort of see this very high-level focus. The G7, of course, again, emphasized support for Ukraine and its commitment to hold Russia accountable and to continue applying economic pressure on Russia as long as it remains inside Ukraine's borders. The final piece that we can talk about, and this, I guess, is a very summit-heavy episode, is, the sort of flip side to all of this Western summitry with NATO and the G7, which is the recently concluded virtual summit meeting of the BRICS, right? This is a group that might seem a little passé, just given the divergent economic trajectories of the 5 member states, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. the acronym BRICS, of course, coming from their names. But I think the organization, the 5 countries themselves, I think would very much disagree, just given what they talked about. They released a Beijing declaration, China being the host this year. A lot in there. I think Chinese President Xi Jinping, who chaired the meeting, had a lot to say about sort of systemic issues, including sort of lashing out at the West for sanctioning Russia. India's presence, I think, in the BRICS again is always interesting. I think, especially in the context of the scrutiny that New Delhi has received over its position with regard to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the big thing, I think, is of course Putin's participation in the BRICS. I mean, this is the highest leader level engagement in a multilateral format that Putin has enjoyed since the invasion of Ukraine. And I think it really emphasizes the difficulty in totally isolating Russia, because Russia continues to, of course, engage with not only the BRICS states, but a whole group of countries around the world more generally. The other thing that's, I think, notable here is the BRICS appears to be on the cusp of expanding, which I don't know how they will do that, just given that the group is fundamentally named around the 5 founding countries. But Argentina has expressed concern or has expressed interest in joining, as well as Iran, I believe, as of today. We'll have to see where that actually goes. But any impressions from you, Katie, on the BRICS meeting?
Yeah, so my first thought as I was going through the Beijing Declaration, there's a lot in there, and to be a little bit cynical, it reads like diplomatic documents usually read, which is like a laundry list of grievances concealed by nice language about cooperation. There are a lot of references to sovereignty, for example, which reading those with Ukraine on the mind is sort of an interesting. That word doesn't mean what you think it means. And so I find that kind of an interesting contradiction, which this sort of informs my next comment on the idea of expansion. So the BRICS was originally the BRIC. South Africa joined, I think, in 2011 was when South Africa started attending these meetings. But the BRICS doesn't have an institutional framework in the way that NATO or the EU or even the Shanghai Cooperation Organization does. It doesn't have a membership accession process. So I don't really know how the process for Argentina and Iran joining the BRICS would go. I don't know if it's as simple as next time they just invite them as members as opposed to as guests. I don't know. It is also worth noting that this idea of expanding the BRICS it's not novel. This has come up before. Argentina in particular has expressed interest in joining in the past. And I think some of the pushback on that has always been, we've got the perfect number where we have like one country from each continent, or actually, 2. But I don't really know if Iran and Argentina will join, and I don't really know what the value of them joining is to the organization or not. But at this moment, the value of there is a distinct PR value for Russia predominantly, but also China in saying, look, people want to be part of our club, and what that communicates. And you touched on this and you said, Putin has had meetings with leaders from around the world since the invasion of Ukraine. So, while I think the West would like to think Russia is extremely isolated, and certainly in economic terms it is, it's not as politically isolated. And so I think it is worth watching to see what this BRICS expansion may or may not come to. But BRICS is not NATO. BRICS is not the UN. It doesn't have an institutional framework, so it's a talk shop. And so these countries might want to be a greater part of that discussion, but the Argentine president also was a guest at the G7. And so it's not so much an either or, but countries that want to participate more in global conversations see avenues to do so in those organizations, and so that's what they're pursuing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing here is that, the BRICS, when they came together in the late aughts, were large emerging economies. And since then, I think their trajectories, the sizes of their economies, the extent to which they're sanctioned internationally in the case of Russia, all of that has changed. So I think it's sort of an organization that's trying to sort of find its contemporary relevance. I think you're right about the Beijing Declaration. There's a lot of diplomaties in there without
Hmm.
saying quite a bit. Although, some of the remarks I think on hegemony, power politics, sort of leave you with the optics that, this is a club that's trying to sort of set itself apart from the other crew that we talked about in the first part of this episode, which you might call it sort of the rules-based order crew. That the world is in perhaps some ways breaking into these two larger blocks. But I think your comment on Argentina, India, even Brazil. I mean, these countries that continue to sort of forge their relationships with both groups, seeking out opportunities where they might arise, suggest that there's still a lot more complexity to this, and it's not just that the world is cleaving into two broader blocks more generally. But Katie, I think we'll leave it there for today, and I think we'll have a lot to revisit with the outcomes of the NATO summit. Let's see what happens, if there's any major headlines being made. But thanks a lot for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. So for our listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, please leave us a review. You can do that anywhere you get your podcasts. We really appreciate that. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.